In a suburban Colorado kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, 17-year-old Grace Sullivan stared at the plate of cold scraps, her father thrust toward her. While her half-siblings enjoyed fresh breakfast casseroles, her father's words cut deeper than any knife. "This is all you deserve." But Grace wasn't the broken girl he believed her to be. Armed with a hidden college acceptance letter and an aunt who finally saw the truth, Grace was about to shatter the carefully constructed lies that had kept her invisible for years. Some families feast together, others devour their own. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Grace's hand moved mechanically across the kitchen counter, wiping away crumbs that Brandon had left behind. The breakfast rush was over, though rush felt like too generous a word for what had just transpired. It's more like a carefully choreographed performance where she played the role of invisible stagehand. Jennifer had plated fresh pancakes for Brandon and Madison, complete with strawberries arranged in neat little hearts. She'd asked about their dreams, listened to Madison's excited chatter about her art project, praised Brandon's upcoming basketball tryouts. Grace had stood at the counter eating cold cereal from a chipped bowl, watching the show unfold like a spectator to her own life. "Grace, don't forget you need to pick up the groceries after school," Jennifer called from the living room, her tone carrying that particular edge that made it clear this wasn't a request. "I've left the list on the refrigerator. Make sure you get everything. We can't afford mistakes with company coming." Company. Aunt Patricia's impending visit had transformed the house into something that felt more like a theater set than a home. Jennifer had been scrubbing surfaces that were already clean, rearranging furniture, coaching Brandon and Madison on their best behavior. Grace had been given a different set of instructions entirely. Stay out of the way, don't cause problems, make yourself useful. The familiar ache settled in her chest as she gathered her backpack. Years of practice had taught her to swallow it down, to accept that this was simply how things were. Some families had golden children. Hers had Brandon and Madison. Some families had disappointments. That role belonged to her. At school, Grace moved through her classes with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything else. She turned in her assignments, participated when called upon, and retreated to the library during lunch. It was there, surrounded by the comforting scent of old books and the gentle hum of whispered conversations, that she felt most like herself. Grace. Mr. Williams appeared beside her table, his expression carrying that particular concern she'd learned to deflect. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" She followed him to his office, noting the way other students looked right through her as she passed. The invisibility that felt suffocating at home was almost a comfort here. It meant no questions, no attention, no expectations she might fail to meet. "I wanted to discuss your college applications," Mr. Williams said, settling behind his desk. "You've got excellent grades, strong test scores. Have you heard back from any schools yet?" The question hit like a small punch to her stomach. "I know, not yet." The lie came automatically, a protective reflex she'd developed over years, of learning that her achievements were either dismissed or ignored. But the truth was more complicated. There had been mail yesterday, thick envelopes that made her heart race with possibility. She'd found them tucked behind a stack of bills and catalogs, and the placement felt too deliberate to be accidental. Her acceptance letter to Colorado State University had been buried like an unwanted secret. Mr. Williams studied her face with the careful attention of someone who'd spent years reading between the lines of what students didn't say. "Grace, everything all right at home? I know the holidays can be stressful." "Everything's fine," she said quickly. The response was as automatic as breathing now. Everything was fine. Everything was normal. This was just how families worked, wasn't it? The afternoon dragged by with the weight of unspoken truths. Grace collected the groceries Jennifer had demanded, her cart filled with expensive items for the holiday meal she'd be expected to prepare but not truly participate in. The checkout clerk smiled and wished her a happy Thanksgiving. And Grace managed to smile back, wondering if the woman could see the careful performance for what it was. Henderson's books felt like a sanctuary after the sterile brightness of the grocery store. The shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, packed with stories of people who mattered, who fought for what they believed in, who were seen and heard and valued. Grace lost herself in the familiar routine of organizing returns, helping customers find their perfect escape, and breathing in the peace that came with being surrounded by words that understood her better than her own family ever had. "You're quiet tonight," Mrs. Henderson observed, her voice carrying the gentle warmth that always made Grace's chest tighten with something dangerously close to hope, more so than usual. Grace looked up from the stack of books she'd been shelving, meeting the older woman's kind eyes. Mrs. Henderson had a way of seeing people really seeing them that Grace had never experienced at home. It was unsettling and comforting in equal measure.
Oh.
"Just thinking about Thanksgiving," Grace said, which was true enough. "Family gatherings can be complicated," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone carefully neutral. "Sometimes the holidays bring out the best in people. Sometimes things come to light that we wish had stayed hidden." There was something about the way Mrs. Henderson said it that made Grace look up abruptly. Though she was calmly sorting books like always, the tightness in her shoulders hinted the remark wasn't just idle chatter. "Would you like to pick up some extra hours over the holiday weekend?" Mrs. Henderson asked gently. "I know most teens spend that time with their families, but if you need somewhere to be—" The words hung between them, thick with unspoken meaning. Grace felt a sting behind her eyes and quickly blinked it away. Crying was dangerous. It invited questions she wasn't ready to face. "I'd like that," she said quietly. "Thank you." The drive home felt unusually long. Each mile carried her closer to a house that had never really felt like hers. And hidden in her backpack was her acceptance letter to Colorado Steta. Private glimmer of hope. Something she held tightly against the daily emotional bruises she endured. When she pulled into the driveway, she lingered in the car, watching as warm light glowed through the windows. From the outside, the house looked perfect. A cozy, happy home ready for the holidays. But Grace knew better. She'd learned long ago that the most dangerous lies were the ones wrapped in normalcy, gathering her things. She braced herself before stepping back into her assigned role. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was beginning to shift. Maybe it was Mrs. Henderson's quiet kindness, Mr. Williams' concern, or just the heavy burden of her unspoken truth. Whatever it was, it felt like the first crack in a carefully constructed foundation. Once a foundation begins to crack, it doesn't take much to bring everything crashing down. Grace didn't know it yet, but tomorrow would be the breaking point. She stepped into the house, the door clicking shut behind her with a finality that felt heavier than usual. "Grace, is that you?" Jennifer's voice called sharply from the kitchen, already edged with frustration, as if Grace had done something wrong just by walking in. "Did you get everything on the list?" "Yes," Grace replied, placing the grocery bags on the counter and starting to unpack, organizing each item with quiet precision. Jennifer stood nearby, inspecting her work like a drill sergeant. "These cranberries look bruised," she said, holding the bag up as if it were proof of Grace's incompetence. "I specifically asked for fresh ones. They look fine to me," Grace said, examining the perfectly good cranberries. "Well, I suppose they'll have to do," Jennifer said, with a long-suffering sigh. "Your father's sister is very particular. You can't give her any reason to criticize this family." Grace caught the familiar sting in those words, "this family." Jennifer always said it that way, as if Grace were on the outside looking in. Michael appeared from his office, phone still to his ear, wearing the smooth, practiced charm he saved for work. "Yes, Patricia, everything's all set. We're excited to see you," he said, his eyes sliding over Grace with the indifferent glance he gave inanimate objects. "Yes, the entire family will be here." Grace felt that now familiar ache. Quiet erasure, the way she was only visible when chores needed doing. In every other moment, she was invisible, like a ghost in the home she lived in. After hanging up, Michael turned to her. "Your aunt is staying in the guest room. Make sure it's clean tomorrow. I'll help," Madison chirped from the kitchen table, where she was coloring. "I want to pick flowers for Aunt Patricia." "It's very sweet, Jennifer," said, smiling as she ruffled Madison's hair. "Don't worry about cleaning. That's Grace's responsibility." Brandon glanced up from his phone long enough to add, "Yeah, Grace is good at that kind of stuff, like service work." The comment hit Grace like a slapnod out of cruelty, but because of how casual it was, Brandon hadn't meant to be. That's what made it worse, was simply how he saw her, as someone who belonged in a role beneath everyone else. This was simply how their family hierarchy worked in his mind. Actually, Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt, I got accepted to Colorado State University. The words hung in the air for a moment, creating a silence that felt charged. With something Grace couldn't quite identify, Jennifer's hand stilled on Madison's hair. Michael's attention sharpened in a way that made Grace's stomach clench. When did this happen? Michael asked, his tone carefully controlled. The letter came yesterday. Early admission. Grace tried to inject some pride into her voice, the way she imagined other teenagers might when sharing good news with their families. Colorado State? Jennifer's eyebrows rose. That's nice, I suppose. Though I'm not sure how you expect to pay for it. There are scholarships, Grace said. Financial aid? I've been researching research, Michael interrupted with a laugh that held no warmth. Grace, you need to be realistic about your options. College is expensive, and we've got Brandon and Madison to think about. They're going to need every advantage we can give them. That for a moment Grace wondered if she'd imagined sharing her news at all. She watched as Michael turned his attention back to his phone, the conversation apparently over in his mind. Besides, Jennifer added, loading dishes into the dishwasher with unnecessary force. You've always been more suited to practical work. There's nothing wrong with that. Not everyone needs a college degree. Grace stood in the kitchen, surrounded by her family, and felt more alone than she ever had sitting by herself in the library. The acceptance letter in her backpack seemed to burn with possibility and promise, but here in this house, it might as well have been written in invisible ink. Later, as she prepared for bed in her basement room, a space that had been created when Jennifer decided the upstairs bedrooms were better suited for the real children, Grace pulled out her phone and stared at Ethan's contact information. She'd been carrying her secrets for so long that the weight of them felt normal now. But something about today, about the casual dismissal of her achievements and the way her family spoke about her as if she weren't there, had shifted something. Inside her, her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before she finally typed, "Can we talk tomorrow? Before you leave for your family stuff?" Ethan's response came almost immediately. "Of course. Everything okay?" Grace stared at the question. For several minutes, everything was exactly as it had always been, which was precisely the problem. "I think I need to tell you some things," she typed back, "about my family." The three dots appeared and disappeared several times before Ethan's response came through. "I'm here whenever you're ready." Grace set her phone aside and lay back on her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow, Aunt Patricia would arrive with her outsider's eyes and her memories of Grace's mother. Tomorrow, the carefully constructed facade of family happiness would be tested by someone who remembered when Grace had been loved unconditionally. For the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to wonder what that might reveal. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she was prepared for the answer. Grace wasn't sure she was prepared for the answer, but morning arrived with its own relentless momentum. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through fragments of conversations. With Ethan, that hadn't happened yet, and confrontations with her family that might never come. The house buzzed with nervous energy as Jennifer orchestrated the final preparations for Aunt Patricia's arrival. Grace watched from the kitchen as her stepmother directed Brandon and Madison in arranging flowers and fluffing cushions. Their faces bright with the kind of excitement that came from being included in something special. "Grace," Jennifer called without looking in her direction. "The guest bathroom needs fresh towels. And make sure there are no water spots on the mirror." Grace climbed the stairs to the linen closet, passing the family photo gallery that lined the hallway. She'd walked past these pictures thousands of times, but today something made her pause. There, where her 8th grade school photo used to hang, was a newer picture of Brandon at his middle school graduation. Her junior prom photo had been replaced with Madison's art class picture. She stood there for a moment, studying the visual narrative of her family's life. The progression was subtle but unmistakable as the years went on. Grace appeared less frequently, relegated to the edges of group shots before disappearing entirely. The most recent photos showed a family of 4: Michael, Jennifer, Brandon, and Madison, a complete unit with no missing pieces. Grace Jennifer's voice carried up the stairs with an edge of impatience. What's taking so long? She finished her tasks with mechanical efficiency, each action feeling like another small surrender to the role they'd assigned her. When Aunt Patricia's car finally pulled into the driveway, Grace was wiping down baseboards in the guest room. Work that would go unnoticed but would somehow be her fault if left undone. From the upstairs window, she watched her aunt emerge. From her silver sedan, her movements carrying the same confident energy. Grace remembered from childhood visits that had become increasingly rare over the years. Patricia looked exactly as Grace remembered, silver-streaked dark hair, warm brown eyes, and a smile that seemed to light up her entire face. The greeting downstairs was a symphony of manufactured warmth. Grace could hear Michael's booming voice, Jennifer's practiced laugh, and the excited chatter of Brandon and Madison. She descended the stairs slowly, smoothing her hands over her jeans and trying to prepare herself for whatever role she was expected to play in this performance. "There she is," Patricia said as Grace appeared in the living room doorway. The warmth in her voice was so genuine that Grace felt something crack open in her chest. "Grace, honey, come here." Patricia's hug was fierce and real, nothing like the perfunctory embraces Grace had grown accustomed to. She smelled like vanilla and something floral, and for a moment Grace allowed herself to sink into the comfort of being held by someone who seemed genuinely happy to see her. "Let me look at you," Patricia said, holding Grace at arm's length. "You've grown up so much. You look so much like your mother at your age." The comment created a ripple of tension through the room. Grace felt Michael stiffen beside her, saw Jennifer's smile tighten almost imperceptibly. It was a reaction she'd learned to recognize any mention of her mother. Any connection to the life that existed before Jennifer and the real children was treated like a dangerous breach of protocol. "She's got her own look," Michael said. "Quickly, takes after the Sullivan side now." But Patricia wasn't paying attention to him. She was studying Grace's face with the kind of focused attention Grace hadn't experienced in years. "You have Sarah's eyes," she said softly, and that same thoughtful expression she got when she was processing something important. Tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She'd spent so many years feeling invisible that being truly seen felt almost overwhelming. Aunt Patricia brought presents, Madison announced, clearly sensing the adult conversation was moving into territory that didn't include her. "I did indeed," Patricia said, though her eyes remained on Grace for a moment longer. "But first, I want to hear about what everyone's been up to, Grace. Your father tells me you're a senior now. College applications must be keeping you busy." The question was casual enough, but Grace caught something in her aunt's tone that suggested genuine interest. "I actually got accepted to Colorado State," she said carefully. "That's wonderful." Patricia's enthusiasm was immediate and unguarded. Early admission is incredibly competitive. You must have worked so hard for that. Grace felt a flush of something that might have been pride. When was the last time someone had celebrated her achievements instead of dismissing them? "It's not that big a deal," Michael interjected. "State schools aren't exactly prestigious." Patricia's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a shadow crossing her features so quickly Grace might have imagined it. "Colorado State has an excellent reputation," she said evenly. "In early admission, there is definitely something to be proud of." The conversation continued around the living room, but Grace noticed how Patricia's attention kept returning to her. There were questions about her classes, her job at the bookstore, her plans for the future. Questions that suggested Patricia saw her as a person with agency and potential rather than just another household fixture. When Jennifer announced it was time to start dinner preparations, Grace automatically moved toward the kitchen. But Patricia caught her arm gently. "Actually," she said, "I was hoping Grace could show me around the neighborhood first. I'd love to see how much it's changed since I was here last." "Oh, that's not necessary," Jennifer said quickly. "Grace has so much to do for tomorrow's dinner. I really need her help with." "I'm sure one of the other kids could help," Patricia said, her tone pleasant but firm. "Brandon, Madison, why don't you give your mom a hand while Grace and I catch up?" It wasn't really a question, and Grace found herself walking out the front door beside her aunt before anyone could raise further objections. The November air was crisp and sharp, carrying the promise of winter and something else, something that felt like possibility. They walked in comfortable silence for several minutes before Patricia spoke again. "Grace," she said quietly, "need you to know that I see you, see how hard you're working, how much you've accomplished on your own, and I see how you're being treated in that house." Grace's step faltered. The words she'd been carrying alone for so long suddenly felt too heavy to hold. "I should have said something sooner," Patricia continued. "I should have done something. But I'm here now, and I want you to know that whatever you need, whatever it takes, you don't have to face it alone anymore." Grace stopped walking altogether, her breath coming in short puffs in the cold air. For years, she'd convinced herself that this was normal, that every family had their dynamics, that she was simply being too sensitive or expecting too much. But standing here with someone who had known her mother, someone who remembered when Grace had been the center of her father's world instead of the burden on its edges, she couldn't maintain those careful rationalizations anymore. "I don't know what to do," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. Patricia's hand found hers, warm and solid and real. "We'll figure it out together," she said. "But first, let's get through this weekend. I want to see exactly what's been happening in that house." As they turned back toward home, Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the presence of an ally. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving, and for the first time since she could remember, she had something genuine to be grateful for. Tomorrow was Thanksgiving, and for the first time since she could remember, Grace had something genuine to be grateful for. But as Thursday morning dawned gray and cold, that gratitude was quickly overshadowed by the familiar weight of expectation and obligation. Grace was awake before sunrise, as had become her tradition on holidays. While the rest of the family slept, she began the elaborate dance of meal preparation that Jennifer would later claim credit for. The turkey went into the oven first, its golden skin already glistening with the herb butter she'd prepared the night before. By the time the others began stirring, Grace had already prepared the stuffing, started the cranberry sauce, and begun peeling potatoes. The kitchen moved around her in a choreographed chaos as Jennifer emerged to oversee operations with the intensity of a general commanding troops. "Make sure the gravy doesn't lump," Jennifer instructed, though Grace had been making gravy since she was 12. "And don't forget to baste the turkey every hour. Aunt Patricia expects everything to be perfect." Grace nodded, her hands already busy with the next task. She'd learned long ago that efficiency was her best defense against criticism. She could anticipate every need, complete every task before it was requested. Maybe she could avoid the subtle disappointments and casual corrections that marked her daily interactions with Jennifer. Patricia appeared in the kitchen doorway around 10, her hair still slightly mussed from sleep, and her expression soft with morning drowsiness. "Da-da, it smells incredible in here," she said, surveying the controlled chaos. "Grace, this is amazing." "Jennifer's an excellent cook," Michael said quickly, appearing behind his sister with a coffee mug in hand. "Always puts on quite a spread for the holidays." Grace felt the familiar sting of having her work attributed to someone else. But Patricia's sharp glance in her direction suggested she'd caught the subtle theft of credit. "I'm sure Jennifer supervised beautifully," Patricia said carefully. "But it looks like Grace did most of the actual cooking. It's quite a skill for someone your age." The compliment warmed Grace more than it should have. She'd grown so accustomed to her efforts being invisible that simple acknowledgement felt revolutionary. As the day progressed, Grace found herself caught between her usual role as invisible servant and Patricia's persistent efforts to include her in family conversations. During the traditional pre-dinner gathering in the living room, Patricia asked about her college plans, her job at the bookstore, her favorite subjects in school. Each question felt like a small rebellion against the family dynamic that had relegated Grace to the background. Michael's responses grew increasingly terse, while Jennifer's smile became more strained with each passing hour. "Grace has always been very independent," Jennifer said when Patricia asked about Grace's extracurricular activities. "She prefers to keep to herself. Is that true?" Patricia asked Grace directly, ignoring the subtle warning in Jennifer's tone. Grace felt all eyes on her, the weight of years of conditioning telling her to agree, to play her assigned role, to not make waves. "I work a lot," she said carefully. "At Henderson's Books downtown. Mrs. Henderson is She's been really supportive." "That's wonderful," Patricia said. "It's so important to have mentors outside the family who can offer different perspectives." The emphasis on different perspectives wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. While Jennifer busied herself unnecessarily rearranging the coffee table decorations, when dinner was finally served, Grace found herself in the familiar position of ensuring everyone else's plates were full while her own remained empty. She moved between kitchen and dining room, refilling water glasses, bringing forgotten items, playing the role of invisible server that had become second nature. "Grace, sit down," Patricia said firmly when Grace appeared with the second round of rolls. "You've been working all day. Let someone else handle the serving." "Oh, she doesn't mind," Jennifer said quickly. "Grace likes to stay busy, don't you, Grace?" The question hung in the air, loaded with unspoken expectations. Grace felt the familiar pressure to agree, to maintain the fiction that her servitude was voluntary, that she preferred the shadows to the spotlight. "Actually," Patricia said before Grace could respond, "I think Grace should say grace this year. It seems fitting." The suggestion created a moment of electric silence. Michael's fork paused halfway to his mouth while Jennifer's smile became so forced it looked painful. "That's not necessary," Michael said. "Grace isn't really comfortable with public speaking." "I don't mind," Grace heard herself saying, the words emerging before she could censor them. She looked around the table at Brandon and Madison's curious faces, at Jennifer's barely concealed irritation, at Michael's obvious displeasure, and finally at Patricia's encouraging smile. "I'm grateful," Grace began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands, "for the people who see me, who recognize that I'm worth more than I've been taught to believe. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to build something better for myself, even when that means disappointing people who would rather keep me small." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Grace hadn't planned them, hadn't rehearsed this moment of quiet rebellion. But something about Patricia's presence had given her permission to speak truths she'd been swallowing for years. "Well," Jennifer said after a moment, her voice bright with false cheer, "that was unique." But Patricia was looking at Grace with something that might have been pride. And for the first time in years, Grace felt like she'd said exactly what needed to be said. The rest of the meal proceeded with the kind of careful politeness that follows uncomfortable revelations. Grace ate her dinner, actually ate it. Instead of just serving others while, Patricia steered conversations toward neutral topics that, nonetheless, managed to highlight Grace's intelligence and accomplishments. When Brandon mentioned his C+ in algebra, Patricia asked Grace about her advanced calculus class. When Madison showed off her latest drawing, Patricia inquired about Grace's photography hobby that she'd somehow discovered during their walk yesterday. Each acknowledgement felt like a small revolution, a crack in the foundation of invisibility that had defined Grace's place in this family for so long. As the day wound down and the dishes were cleared with Patricia insisting that everyone help, not just Grace, Grace found herself cautiously hopeful. Maybe things could be different. Maybe she didn't have to accept crumbs and call them a feast. The feeling lasted until Friday morning, when she discovered exactly how far her family was willing to go to maintain the status quo. The feeling lasted until Friday morning, when Grace discovered exactly how far her family was willing to go to maintain the status quo. She padded down to the kitchen in her pajamas, drawn by the scent of something that smelled suspiciously like yesterday's turkey being transformed into something delicious. The sight that greeted her was like a physical blow. The rest of the family sat around the breakfast table, forks in hand, enjoying what was clearly a expertly prepared breakfast casserole made from Thanksgiving leftovers. Steam rose from their plates, carrying the rich aroma of turkey, stuffing, and eggs baked together into something that looked magazine-worthy. Madison was laughing at something Brandon had said, while Jennifer poured fresh orange juice into everyone's glasses. It was the picture of a warm, loving family, enjoying the aftermath of a successful holiday. Except Grace wasn't part of the picture. Michael looked up as she entered, his expression carrying that particular blend of mild irritation and dismissal she'd learned to dread. Without a word, he reached beside his chair and picked up a paper plate, the kind used for picnics or children's parties, loaded with what could only be described as scraps. Cold turkey that looked like it had been hacked off the bone with no care for presentation. Congealed gravy that had formed a skin on top. Stuffing that had separated into its component parts and looked more like breadcrumb soup. Even the cranberry sauce was the jellied stuff from a can rather than the homemade version Grace had spent an hour preparing yesterday. He held the plate toward her with the casual indifference of someone feeding a dog. "This is all you deserve," he said, his voice carrying a coldness that made Grace's stomach clench. The words hit her like a slap, not just because of their cruelty, but because of their casual delivery. This wasn't anger or frustration or a moment of poor judgment. This was calculated dismissal, served up as naturally as breathing. Patricia, who had been buttering a piece of toast, went completely still. Her fork remained suspended in midair as she stared at Michael with an expression of dawning horror. "Excuse me?" Patricia's voice was deadly quiet. Michael seemed to realize his mistake the moment the words had left his mouth, but it was too late to take them back. "I just meant Grace usually doesn't eat much breakfast anyway. She prefers to keep things simple." "Sybil." Patricia stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor. "You just handed your daughter a plate of garbage and told her it's all she deserves, and you call that simple?" "Patricia, you don't understand the dynamic here," Jennifer interjected, her tone carrying that particular blend of condescension and false reasonableness she used when defending the indefensible. "Grace has always been a bit difficult about food. She's very particular, prefers to make her own choices about what she eats." "Difficult?" Patricia's voice rose an octave. "She's been cooking for this entire family since she was 12 years old. She prepared 90% of yesterday's meal while the rest of you sat around accepting praise for her work." Grace stood frozen in the doorway, a plate of scraps still in her father's outstretched hand, watching her aunt fight a battle she'd never dared fight for herself. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Michael said, his charm completely evaporated now. "Grace is my daughter, and how I choose to parent her is none of your business." "Parent her?" Patricia's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Is that what you call this?" "Michael, I've been watching for 2 days. I've seen how you treat her like hired help. I've seen how you dismiss her achievements, ignore her contributions, and make her invisible in her own family. That's ridiculous." Jennifer snapped. "Grace is part of this family. You love her just as much as Brandon and Madison, really." Patricia turned her fury on Jennifer. "When was the last time you asked Grace about her day? When did you last celebrate one of her accomplishments? Hell, when did you last make her a plate of food instead of expecting her to serve everyone else first?" Brandon and Madison sat in stunned silence, their forks forgotten as they watched the adult world explode around them. Grace could see confusion in their faces. This wasn't how they'd been taught to see their family dynamic. "You want to know what I see?" Patricia continued, her voice building to something that was almost a shout. "I see a brilliant, talented, hardworking girl who's been conditioned to accept crumbs because that's all you've ever offered her. I see a teenager who works her ass off to maintain this household while you two take credit for her efforts. And I see a father who's so consumed by his own unresolved grief that he's made his own daughter pay the price for reminding him of what he lost." The silence that followed was deafening. Grace could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of years of suppressed truth hanging in the air like smoke after an explosion. Michael's face had gone white, then red, then an alarming shade of purple. "How dare you come into my house and your house?" Grace's voice cut through his building tirade like a knife. She'd spoken so quietly that everyone had to strain to hear her, but something in her tone made them all turn to look at her. For 17 years, Grace had swallowed her anger, accepted less than she deserved, played the role of grateful recipient of whatever scraps were thrown her way. But standing here, watching her aunt fight for her while her father held a plate of garbage and told her it was all she was worth, something inside her finally broke. Not broke like something fragile and irreparable, but broke like a dam that had been holding back years of suppressed rage and hurt and desperate longing to be seen as worthy of love. "Your house?" she repeated, her voice getting stronger. This is my house too. I've cleaned every inch of it, cooked meals in this kitchen since I was barely tall enough to reach the stove. Done homework at this table, lived and breathed and existed in these rooms for 17 years. But you've never once made me feel like I belonged here. Michael set the plate down hard on the counter, making everyone jump. Grace, you're being dramatic. I've given you everything. Everything. Grace's laugh was sharp and painful. You've given me a basement bedroom, hand-me-down clothes, and the privilege of serving your real family. You've hidden my college acceptance letters, dismissed my achievements, and made me feel like I should be grateful for basic human decency. That's not true, Jennifer protested, but her voice lacked conviction, isn't it?
Oh.
Grace turned to face her stepmother directly. Tell me one single time you've celebrated something I accomplished. Tell me about one conversation we've had where you asked about my hopes or dreams or fears. Tell me one moment where you treated me like I was your daughter instead of your live-in help. Jennifer's mouth opened and closed without sound, and Grace felt a fierce satisfaction at rendering her speechless. This ends now, Patricia said firmly. Grace, go pack your things. You're coming home with me. The declaration hung in the air like a lifeline Grace hadn't dared to hope for. A moment, the kitchen was completely silent, except for the sound of Madison quietly crying. Then Michael exploded. Like hell she is. 17 years old, and she's my daughter, and she's not going anywhere. Watch me, Grace said quietly, and walked out of the room. Behind her, she could hear Patricia's voice, steady and sure. Actually, Michael, let's talk about exactly what rights you have left where Grace is concerned, because I think you're about to discover it's a lot less than you imagine. Behind her, Grace could hear Patricia's voice, steady and sure. Actually, Michael, let's talk about exactly what rights you have left where Grace is concerned, because I think you're about to discover it's a lot less than you imagine. Grace climbed the stairs to her basement room on unsteady legs, her hands shaking as she pulled her duffel bag from the closet. The adrenaline of confrontation was wearing off, leaving behind a mixture of terror and exhilaration that made her feel dizzy. She'd done it. She'd actually stood up to them. But now what? Her hands moved automatically, folding clothes and gathering the few possessions that truly mattered to her. The acceptance letter from Colorado State. Her mother's jewelry box that she'd rescued from storage years ago. The worn copy of Jane Eyre that Mrs. Henderson had given her for her 16th birthday. A photograph of her and her mother at the zoo when Grace was 6, both of them laughing at something just outside the frame. The sound of raised voices drifted up from the kitchen, but Grace couldn't make out individual words. She didn't need to. The pattern was familiar. Michael's aggressive defense, Jennifer's wounded martyrdom, Patricia's unwavering confrontation of uncomfortable truths. A soft knock on her door made her freeze. Grace? Brandon's voice was smaller than she'd ever heard it. Can I come in? She opened the door to find her half-brother standing in the hallway, his face pale and confused. For the first time in years, he looked his age, just a 14-year-old boy trying to make sense of a world that had suddenly revealed itself to be far more complicated than he'd understood. Are you really leaving? He asked. Grace studied his face, searching for some sign of the casual cruelty or dismissive indifference she'd grown accustomed to. Instead, she saw something that looked like genuine distress. Yeah, she said softly. I think I am. Brandon stepped into her room, looking around as if seeing it for the first time, which Grace realized he probably was. When had any of them ever visited her down here? When had anyone in the family ever sought her out just to talk? I didn't. No, he said quietly. About the college letter, about any of it. Grace paused in her packing. What didn't you know? That Dad was hiding your mail? You've been doing all the cooking? I mean, I knew you helped a lot, but I thought Jennifer was the one who... He trailed off, his face flushing with embarrassment. It's okay, Grace said, and was surprised to realize she meant it. You were just a kid. You believed what they told you. But I'm not a kid anymore, Brandon said. Should have noticed. I should have said something. They stood in awkward silence for a moment, the weight of years of invisible inequality hanging between them. Grace had imagined this conversation countless times, the moment when her half-siblings would finally see how differently she'd been treated. But she'd always pictured it accompanied by dramatic apologies and pledges of changed behavior. The reality was quieter, more complicated. Brandon's confusion seemed genuine, but it couldn't erase years of accepting benefits that came at Grace's expense. Grace. Patricia's voice called from the top of the basement stairs. "Can you come up here, please?" Grace shouldered her bag and followed Brandon back upstairs. The kitchen had been transformed into what looked like a war zone. Michael sat at the table with his head in his hands, while Jennifer stood by the window with her arms crossed defensively. Addison was nowhere to be seen. Patricia stood in the center of it all, her phone in one hand and a notebook in the other, looking like a general who'd just won a decisive battle. "Been making some calls," Patricia said without preamble. 2 lawyers, 2 social services, 2 college financial aid offices. "Grace, you have more options than you realize." "She's not going anywhere," Michael said without looking up. "She's 17. She's my responsibility." Actually, Patricia's voice carried the satisfied tone of someone who'd done her homework. "Grace is 18 in 2 months. At that point, your parental authority ends automatically. But more importantly, I've confirmed that in Colorado. 17-year-old can petition for emancipation if they can demonstrate financial independence and maturity." Grace felt her heart skip. "Emancipation? This means you become legally independent," Patricia explained. "You can make your own decisions about where to live, where to go to school, how to spend your money. And given that you've been financially supporting yourself through work and have been accepted to college, you meet the basic requirements." "This is insane," Jennifer burst out. "Grace, you're being manipulated. Patricia is filling your head with ideas that will ruin your life. You need your family. You need stability. Stability." Grace almost laughed. "You call this stable? Being treated like hired help in my own home? Having my achievements dismissed and my mail hidden? It's being told I deserve scraps while everyone else gets a feast?" "We've provided for you," Michael said, finally looking up. His eyes were re-dimmed and desperate. "You've had a roof over your head, food to eat, clothes to wear. Do you have any idea how many kids would be grateful for what you've had?" "Grateful," Grace repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "You want me to be grateful for the bare minimum while my siblings get everything? You want me to thank you for treating me like a burden you couldn't wait to get rid of?" "That's not," Michael started, but Patricia cut him off. "Michael, stop. Just stop. Look at what you've done to her. Look at how she flinches when you raise your voice. Look at how she apologizes for taking up space in her own home. This isn't love. This isn't parenting. This is abuse, and it stops now." The word hung in the air like a bomb. Abuse. Grace had never applied that label to her. Situation abuse was dramatic, violent, obvious. Her situation was just normal family dysfunction, wasn't it? Looking at her father's face, seeing the guilt and anger warring there, Grace realized Patricia was right. It had been abuse. Subtle, psychological, devastating abuse that had taught her to accept less than she deserved and be grateful for it. "Grace," Patricia said gently, "you don't have to decide everything right now, but you can come stay with me while we figure out your options. You can finish school, apply for emancipation if that's what you want, and start building the life you deserve." Grace looked around the kitchen where she'd spent so many hours cooking for people who barely acknowledged her existence. At the table where her achievements had been dismissed and her worth questioned. At the family who had taught her to be invisible. And she looked at Patricia, who saw her clearly and thought she was worth fighting for. "Okay," Grace said quietly. "Let's go." As she walked toward the door, bag in hand, she heard Madison's small voice from the living room. "Grace, will you still be my sister?" Grace paused, her heart clenching. "I'll always be your sister, Maddie, but I won't always live here." It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was an honest one. And honesty, Grace was learning, was the first step toward freedom. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was an honest one. And honesty, Grace was learning, was the first step toward freedom. She loaded her bags into Patrice's car while her father stood in the doorway, his face cycling through emotions she couldn't quite read. The drive to Patricia's house passed in relative silence, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. Grace pressed her forehead against the cool window, watching familiar neighborhoods blur past, and feeling like she was seeing them for the first time. "Are you okay?" Patricia asked as they pulled into her driveway. Grace considered the question. Seriously? Was she okay? She felt hollowed out and raw, like someone had reached inside her chest and rearranged everything. But underneath the disorientation was something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. "I think I will be," she said. Patricia's house was everything Grace's had never been, warm, welcoming, filled with books and plants and the kind of casual comfort that spoke of a life lived with intention rather than performance. The guest room Patricia showed her was twice the size of her basement space, with windows that actually let in natural light. "This is temporary," Patricia said, settling into the reading chair by the window. "Until we figure out what comes next. But Grace, I want you to know that whatever you decide, you have my full support." Over the next few hours, Patricia proved that support wasn't just words. She made phone calls with the efficiency of someone who'd spent her career navigating bureaucratic systems. Social services, legal aid organizations, college financial aid offices. She worked through a list with methodical determination. "Emancipation is definitely possible," she reported after hanging up with a family law attorney. "The process typically takes a few months, but given your circumstances and your college acceptance, the timeline could be accelerated." Grace sat cross-legged on the guest bed, her laptop open to Colorado State's website. "What about tuition?" "Even with financial aid, that's where things get interesting," Patricia said, consulting her notes. "As an emancipated minor, you'd qualify for significantly more financial aid. The federal government would classify you as an independent student, which changes everything." The numbers Patricia showed her were staggering. What had seemed like an impossible financial burden suddenly looked manageable. Not easy, but possible. "There's something else," Patricia said carefully. "Something I should have told you years ago. Your mother left a small trust fund for your education. Michael was supposed to tell you about it when you turned 16, but he didn't," Grace finished, feeling another piece of the puzzle click into place. "How much?" "Enough to cover most of your undergraduate expenses, especially combined with the aid you'll qualify for as an independent student." Grace stared at her aunt, struggling to process this revelation. "Why didn't she ever tell me?" "I think she didn't want to interfere," Patricia said softly. "And I think she hoped Michael would do the right thing eventually. But watching what happened this morning, Grace, your mother would be heartbroken to see how you've been treated." They spent the afternoon researching Grace's options, building a practical plan that felt more solid and real with each passing hour. Patricia ordered pizza for dinner, something Grace couldn't remember anyone ever doing just because she was hungry, and they spread paperwork across the kitchen table like generals planning a campaign. "The most important thing is documenting everything," Patricia explained. "The court will want evidence that emancipation is in your best interest. Your academic record, employment history, evidence of financial responsibility, all of that works in your favor." Grace's phone buzzed with texts throughout the evening, Michael alternating between guilt-laden apologies and angry demands that she'd come home. Jennifer's messages were more subtle, but no less manipulative, focusing on how her departure was hurting Brandon and Madison. "They're trying to make you feel responsible for their emotions," Patricia observed, reading over Grace's shoulder. "That's classic manipulation." The insight was like a light switching on. Grace could see the pattern now, the way her family had conditioned her to prioritize their comfort over her own well-being, to feel guilty for having needs or wants that inconvenienced them. Sunday morning brought a new crisis. Grace woke to find 17 missed calls from Michael and a series of increasingly frantic voicemails. "Grace, you need to come home right now. This is insane. Patricia is filling your head with poison, and you're too young to understand what you're giving up. Call me back immediately." The messages escalated from there, growing more desperate and angry with each iteration. By the final voicemail, Michael was no longer asking, he was demanding. "I'm coming to get you." His voice crackled through the phone speaker. "This nonsense ends today. You're coming home where you belong." Patricia found Grace in the kitchen, staring at her phone with a mixture of fear and determination. "He's coming here," Grace said quietly. "Good," Patricia replied, her voice steady. "Let him come. But Grace, you need to be absolutely clear. about what you want. This is your choice, not mine, not his. Whatever you decide, I'll support you. But you need to be sure. Grace thought about her basement room, about years of serving meals she wasn't welcome to share, about college acceptance letters hidden like dirty secrets. She thought about the plate of scraps her father had handed her yesterday morning, and the cold certainty in his voice when he told her it was all she deserved. Then she thought about Patricia fighting for her, about Mrs. Henderson's quiet support, about the possibility of a future where she was valued for who she was, rather than tolerated as an inconvenience. "I'm sure," she said. When Michael's car pulled into the driveway 20 minutes later, Grace was ready for him. She stood beside Patricia in the living room, her spine straight and her resolve firm, prepared to fight for the first thing that had ever truly belonged to her, her own life. The doorbell rang, sharp and demanding in the quiet morning air. "Remember," Patricia said softly, "you have the power here. Yes. You get to choose what comes next." Grace nodded and walked toward the door, each step carrying her further from the girl who had accepted scraps and closer to the woman who knew she deserved so much more. Grace nodded and walked toward the door, each step carrying her further from the girl who had accepted scraps and closer to the woman who knew she deserved so much more. Michael stood on Patricia's front porch like a man preparing for battle. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, signs that he'd spent a sleepless night planning this confrontation. Behind him, Jennifer waited in the car with Brandon and Madison, their faces pressed against the windows with expressions ranging from curiosity to concern. "Grace." Michael's voice carried the forced calm of someone barely containing their rage. "We need to talk." "Then talk," Grace replied, making no move to invite him inside. Something about the threshold felt important, a physical boundary that matched the emotional one she was finally learning to draw. "This is ridiculous," Michael said, his composure already beginning to crack. "You're 17 years old. You don't get to just decide you don't want to be part of your family anymore." "Not deciding I don't want to be part of a family," Grace replied carefully. "I'm deciding I don't want to be part of this family. There's a difference." The distinction hit its mark. Michael's face flushed red, and Grace could see him struggling to maintain the charming facade he'd perfected over the years. "Patricia, you've poisoned her against us," he said, turning his attention to his sister. "You have no idea what you're doing to this family." "I know exactly what I'm doing," Patricia replied from behind Grace. "I'm giving Grace what she should have had all along, someone who sees her worth." "Her worth?" Michael's laugh was harsh and bitter. "She's an ungrateful teenager who doesn't understand how good she's had it. Do you know how many kids would kill for the life we've given her? The life you've given her?" Patricia stepped forward, her voice rising. "Michael, she's been your unpaid domestic help since she was 12 years old. She's cooked your meals, cleaned your house, and raised your other children while you treated her like an inconvenience." "That's not true," Michael protested, but the words lacked conviction. "We've provided for her. She's had everything she needed. Everything she needed." Grace found her voice again, feeling that familiar surge of anger that had been building for years. "I needed a father who didn't blame me for existing. I needed a family who celebrated my achievements instead of hiding them. I needed to feel like I belonged somewhere instead of constantly apologizing for taking up space." Michael's composure finally cracked completely. "You think you're so smart, don't you? Think you can just walk away from your responsibilities? From your family? You're nothing without us, Grace. Nothing. You'll come crawling back within a week." The words were designed to wound, to make Grace doubt herself and return to the safety of familiar misery. A week ago, they might have worked. But standing here with Patricia's support behind her and the knowledge of her own worth finally crystallizing, Grace felt something she'd never experienced before, the absolute certainty that she was worth fighting for. "You're wrong," she said, quietly. "I'm everything despite you, not because of you. I've been building my own life for years while you tried to convince me I didn't deserve one." "Grace, please," Jennifer's voice came from the car window, pitched to carry just the right note of wounded desperation. "Think about Brandon and Madison. Think about what this is doing to them." Grace turned to look at her half-siblings in the back seat. Brandon's face was a mask of confusion and guilt, while Madison pressed a drawing against the window. crayon family portrait that included Grace standing slightly apart from the others, but still part of the group. The sight of that drawing hit Grace harder than all of Michael's anger or Jennifer's manipulation. Madison, at least, had seen her as family. The little girl had included her even while unconsciously positioning her as separate. "I love them," Grace said, her voice carrying to the car. "But loving them doesn't mean I have to accept being treated as less than human. Maybe seeing me stand up for myself will teach them something important about knowing their own worth." Michael made one last, desperate attempt to regain control. "You don't get to make this choice. You're a minor. I'm your father. Call the police and have you brought home." "Actually," Patricia's voice was steady and sure, "you can't. I've spoken with family services and the police. Grace is 17, she's financially independent, and she's staying here voluntarily with a family member. There are no grounds for forcing her to return to an abusive situation." "Abusive?" Michael's voice rose to a shout. "How dare you call me abusive? I never laid a hand on her." "Abuse isn't just physical, Michael," Patricia replied. "Emotional. Neglect is abuse. Making a child feel worthless is abuse. Deliberately sabotaging their future opportunities is abuse. And that's exactly what you've been doing to Grace for years." The truth of those words settled over the confrontation like a heavy blanket. Grace watched her father struggle with the reality of what he'd become, saw the moment when his anger transformed into something that looked almost like recognition. But instead of owning his behavior, Michael retreated into the victim narrative that had sustained him for years. "This is all your fault," he said to Patricia, his voice breaking. "You've taken my daughter away from me. You've destroyed my family." "Your family destroyed itself," Patricia replied without flinching. "I'm just helping Grace build something better." Michael stood there for a long moment, swaying slightly as if the weight of his own choices had finally become too much to bear. Grace found herself waiting for something, an apology, a moment of genuine recognition, some sign that the man who had once been her loving father still existed somewhere beneath years of resentment and misplaced grief. Instead, he turned and walked back to the car without another word. Grace watched him drive away with her half-siblings' faces pressed against the rear window, and felt something inside her chest both break and heal simultaneously. The little girl who had spent years hoping her father would love her the way he once had was finally ready to grieve that loss. The young woman who knew she deserved better was ready to build a life that reflected her worth. "Are you okay?" Patricia asked gently. Grace considered the question seriously. She wasn't okay. She was raw and wounded and terrified of the unknown, future stretching ahead of her. But she was also free in a way she'd never been before. "I'm okay," she said, and meant it. "I'm going to be okay." They spent the rest of Sunday making practical plans. Patricia helped Grace call Mrs. Henderson to explain the situation, and her boss's response was immediate and supportive. "I've been waiting for this day for months," Mrs. Henderson said over the phone. "You bring whatever paperwork you need for emancipation to work tomorrow, and I'll sign any character references you need." And Grace, "I'm proud of you for finally putting yourself first." That evening, Grace sat in Patricia's garden with her laptop, working on her emancipation petition. The legal language was complex, but the core argument was simple. She was mature, enough financially stable enough, and emotionally ready enough to make her own decisions about her life. As she typed, Grace found herself thinking about her mother, the woman she barely remembered, but who had somehow managed to love her enough to ensure she'd have options even after death. The trust fund wasn't just money. It was a message across time that said Grace was worth investing in, worth believing in, worth saving. "Thank you," Grace whispered to the evening air, hoping somehow her mother could hear her. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, legal proceedings, difficult conversations, the hard work of rebuilding her relationship with herself after years of accepting less than she deserved. But tonight, for the first time and longer than she could remember, Grace fell asleep feeling safe and valued and seen. The girl who had been handed scraps and told they were all she deserved was gone. In her place was a young woman who knew her own worth and was finally ready to fight for it. The girl who had been handed scraps and told they were all she deserved was gone. In her place was a young woman who knew her own worth and was finally ready to fight for it. 3 months later, Grace stood in the office of Dr. Elena Rodriguez. The therapist Patricia had helped her find, processing the magnitude of how much her life had changed. "Tell me about the nightmares," Dr. Rodriguez said gently, her pen poised over her notepad. She was a small woman with kind eyes and an ability to make even the most difficult conversations feel safe. Grace shifted in the comfortable chair, still, getting used to being the center of someone's complete, non-judgmental attention. "They're different now. Before, I used to dream about being invisible walking through my house while everyone looked right through me. Now I dream about speaking up, about telling them exactly what I think of how they treated me." "That sounds like progress," Dr. Rodriguez observed. "You're processing anger that you suppressed for years. It's healthy, even if it doesn't feel comfortable." Therapy had been Patricia's suggestion, though Grace had initially resisted. She'd spent so long believing that her problems weren't serious enough to warrant professional help. But Dr. Rodriguez had helped her understand that emotional abuse left scars just as real as physical wounds, and those scars required intentional healing. "I got into University of Denver," Grace said, changing the subject to something that felt safer. "Full scholarship, plus what Mom left me, should cover everything else." "How does that feel?" Grace considered the question. 3 months ago, she would have deflected, minimized her achievement, found a way to make it about someone else. Ow! Now she allowed herself to sit with the pride that bloomed in her chest. "It feels like proof," she said finally. "Proof that I was never the problem, that I was always capable of more than they let me believe." After therapy, Grace drove to Henderson's Books for her shift. Patricia had offered to support her completely, but Grace had insisted on continuing to work. The job wasn't just about money anymore, it was about maintaining the independence she'd fought so hard to achieve. "College girl," Mrs. Henderson called out, as Grace entered, using the nickname that never failed to make Grace smile. "How did the session go?" Mrs. Henderson had become more than a boss over these months. She was a mentor, a surrogate grandmother, and living proof that chosen family could be stronger than blood ties. When Grace had told her about the emancipation proceedings, Mrs. Henderson had not only written a glowing character reference, but had also quietly increased Grace's hours and responsibilities to help strengthen her case for independence. "Good," Grace replied, tying her apron behind her waist. "Dr. Rodriguez thinks I'm making progress." "Of course you are. You're doing the hard work of healing, and that takes courage." The afternoon passed in the comfortable rhythm Grace had grown to love, helping customers find their next great read, organizing new arrivals, and stealing moments to browse the shelves herself. She was deep in conversation with a customer about contemporary young adult fiction when Ethan appeared in the doorway. "Hey," he said, that familiar smile spreading across his face. "Ready for dinner?" The relationship had evolved slowly. Over these months, Ethan had been patient as Grace learned to trust that someone could love her without needing her to be smaller, quieter, or more convenient. He'd celebrated her emancipation, supported her college choice, and never once made her feel like she owed him anything for his affection. "Where to tonight?" Grace asked, gathering her things. "Actually, I was thinking we could cook at Patricia's. I brought ingredients for that pasta dish you like." The suggestion warmed Grace more than any expensive restaurant could have. Ethan understood that home-cooked meals still carried complicated emotions for her, but he'd found ways to make cooking feel like joy rather than obligation. When they cooked together, it was about creativity and connection, not service and submission. Patricia's house had truly become home over these months. Grace had her own space, but was welcomed into every aspect of Patricia's life. They watched movies together, debated politics over breakfast, and shared the kind of easy domesticity Grace had never experienced with her father's family. "How was your day?" Patricia asked, as they prepared dinner together, the three of them moving around the kitchen with comfortable familiarity. "Good. Therapy was helpful, and I got an email from the University of Denver housing office. They approved my application for the honors dorm." Patricia's face lit up with pride. "Grace, that's wonderful." Yeah. The honors program is incredibly competitive. These moments still took Grace by surprise, the immediate celebration of her achievements. The assumption that her successes were worth acknowledging and celebrating. She was learning to accept praise without deflecting it too. believed that her accomplishments mattered. After dinner, Grace retreated to her room to work on her valedictorian speech. The honor had been announced the week before, another achievement that would have been dismissed or ignored in her previous life but was treated as a major celebration here. Her phone buzzed with a text from Madison. "Daddy showed me your picture. In the newspaper, you look really happy." The contact with her half-siblings had been sporadic since she'd left. Michael had initially forbidden any communication. But as the months passed and it became clear that Grace wasn't coming back, the restrictions had loosened slightly. Madison sent occasional drawings and brief messages. Brandon had reached out once to ask about her college plans, their conversation awkward but genuine. Grace typed back, "I am happy, Maddie. I hope you are too." The response came quickly, "I miss you. Will you come to my art show next month?" Grace stared at the message for a long time. The art show would be at Madison's school, which meant potential contact with Michael and Jennifer. But it would also mean supporting her little sister, who had never been anything but kind to her. She walked downstairs to find Patricia reading in the living room, her reading glasses perched on her nose and a cup of tea cooling on the side table. "Madison invited me to her art show," Grace said, settling into the chair across from her aunt. Patricia looked up, immediately understanding the complexity of the situation. "How do you feel about that?" "Scared, angry, protective of myself. But also, I love her. I don't want her to think I abandoned her because of something she did." "What would you need to feel safe going?" The question was so perfectly. Patricia focused on Grace's well-being rather than family obligations or social expectations. "You with me?" Clear boundaries about contact with Michael and Jennifer. And the right to leave if I need to. "Then that's what we'll do," Patricia said simply. "Madison deserves to have someone who loves her in the audience, and you deserve to love your sister without compromising your safety." Later that night, Grace worked on her speech, thinking about the message she wanted to share with her graduating class. She'd initially planned something generic about following dreams and working hard. But sitting here in Patricia's house, surrounded by evidence of how dramatically her life had changed, she realized she had something more important to say. She began typing. 6 months ago, I believed I was worth exactly what I was given. I accepted scraps and called them meals. I took up as little space as possible and apologized for existing. I thought that was normal. I thought that was all I deserved. The words flowed easily, years of suppressed truth finally finding their voice. Grace wrote about the difference between biological family and chosen family, about the courage it takes to walk away from toxicity even when it's dressed up as love, about the radical act of believing you deserve better than what you've been given. When she finished, she had 6 pages of the most honest writing she'd ever done. It was a speech that would certainly ruffle feathers, that would make some people uncomfortable, that would reveal more about her personal life than was probably wise. It was also exactly what she needed to say. Grace saved the document and closed her laptop, feeling the satisfaction that came with speaking truth even when it was difficult. Tomorrow, she would continue building the life she deserved. Tonight, she would sleep peacefully in a house where she was valued, surrounded by people who saw her worth, finally free to become the person she'd always been beneath years of conditioning. The girl who had accepted scraps was truly gone. In her place was a young woman who knew that she deserved the whole feast. The girl who had accepted scraps was truly gone. Her place was a young woman who knew that she deserved the whole feast. 6 months after walking out of her father's house, Grace stood at the podium in her high school auditorium, looking out at a sea of faces that included everyone who had shaped her journey toward this moment. Patricia sat in the front row, her eyes bright with pride and something that looked like vindication. Next to her, Mrs. Henderson dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, while Ethan gave Grace an encouraging thumbs up from his seat with his family. Mr. Williams sat with the other faculty members, its expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of a teacher who had watched a student not just succeed, but transform. And in the back, almost hidden in the shadows near the exit, Grace could see Michael's distinctive profile. He'd come after all, despite the restraining order that kept him from approaching her directly. The sight of him there created a complex swirl of emotions in Grace's chest: anger, sadness, something that might have been pity for the man who had lost his daughter through his own choices. Grace adjusted the microphone and looked down at her speech. The words she'd written and rewritten until they felt like the truest thing she'd ever created. The auditorium fell silent, hundreds of people waiting to hear from the girl who had somehow managed to become valedictorian despite obstacles most of them couldn't imagine. 6 months ago, Grace began, her voice steady and clear. I believed I was worth exactly what I was given. I accepted scraps and called them meals. I took up as little space as possible and apologized for existing. I thought that was normal. I thought that was all I deserved. A ripple of attention moved through the audience. This wasn't the generic inspirational speech they'd been expecting. I'm not here to tell you that hard work guarantees success, or that everything happens for a reason, or that following your dreams will automatically lead to happiness. I'm here to tell you something more important. You have the right to determine your own worth. Grace found Patricia's face in the crowd, drawing strength from her aunt's encouraging nod. Some of you come from families that celebrate your achievements and support your dreams. Some of you have parents who see your potential and invest in your future. If that's your story, be grateful for that gift and use it to lift others up. She paused, her eyes moving to where she knew Michael sat. But some of you come from families that have taught you to accept less than you deserve. You've been told that your dreams are unrealistic, your achievements unimpressive, your very existence an inconvenience. You've learned to be grateful for the bare minimum and to apologize for wanting more. The silence in the auditorium was absolute now. Grace could see some students leaning forward, recognizing themselves in her words. If that's your story, I need you to hear this. They are wrong about you. The people who are supposed to love you unconditionally but place conditions on that love, they are wrong. The family members who make you feel invisible while celebrating, others, they are wrong. The voices that tell you to be grateful for crumbs while others feast, they are wrong. Grace's voice grew stronger with each word, years of suppressed truth finally finding their outlet. I spent 17 years believing that my worth was determined by other people's treatment of me. I thought that if my own family couldn't love me properly, it must be because I was fundamentally unlovable. I was wrong about that. And if you recognize yourself in my story, you're wrong about it too. She looked directly at the section where her fellow students sat, seeing tears on some faces, recognition on others. Your worth is not determined by whether your parents attend your events or celebrate your achievements. It's not measured by whether you get the bedroom upstairs or the basement, whether you're included in family photos or cropped out of them. Your worth is not contingent on making other people comfortable with their own failures. Grace paused to take a breath, feeling the weight of the moment and the responsibility she carried to speak truth that might save someone else years of pain. Real family, the kind worth having, doesn't require you to diminish yourself to make others feel bigger. Real love doesn't ask you to apologize for taking up space. Real support doesn't come with conditions that change based on someone else's mood or agenda. She found Mrs. Henderson in the crowd, thinking of the woman who had shown her what mentorship and genuine care looked like. Sometimes the family that sees your worth isn't the one you were born into. Sometimes the people who celebrate your achievements are the ones you choose, not the ones you share DNA with. And that's not a failure, that's courage. It takes enormous strength to walk away from familiar dysfunction in search of genuine love. Grace's voice softened slightly as she addressed the part of her speech that felt most vulnerable. 6 months ago, I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I chose to leave a situation where I was tolerated and seek out people who would value me. It wasn't easy. It wasn't comfortable. It required giving up the fantasy that someday, somehow, the people who had hurt me might magically transform into the family I needed them to be. She could see movement in the back of the auditorium. Michael, shifting uncomfortably in his seat, probably regretting his decision to attend. But choosing yourself isn't selfish. Demanding better treatment isn't ungrateful. Recognizing your own worth isn't arrogant. It's necessary. It's the foundation upon which you build everything else in your life. Grace looked down at her notes, then back up at the audience, deciding to speak from her heart for these final moments. I'm graduating today with a full scholarship to the University of Denver. I'm financially independent. I'm surrounded by people who see my potential and invest in my success. I'm in therapy, learning to heal from years of conditioning that taught me to accept less than I deserved. And I'm here to tell you that none of this happened because I learned to be more grateful for scraps. It happened because I finally realized I deserved a seat at the table. The auditorium remained completely silent, but Grace could feel the energy in the room shifting, students and parents processing her words in real time. Class of 2024, as you leave here and build your adult lives, remember this: you teach people how to treat you by what you're willing to accept. If you accept scraps, that's what you'll get. If you demand respect, kindness, and genuine love, you might have to wait longer. You might have to look harder. You might have to disappoint people who preferred you small and manageable. But you'll build a life that reflects your actual worth, instead of someone else's limitations. Grace gripped the edges of the podium, delivering her final words with all the conviction she'd built over months of hard-won self-knowledge. Don't let anyone convince you that their inability to love you properly is evidence of your unworthiness. Don't settle for people who make you feel like you should be grateful for their tolerance. And don't ever, ever accept scraps from anyone, and call it a feast. She stepped back from the microphone to thunderous applause, but Grace barely heard it. She was watching Patricia's face, seeing tears of pride streaming down her aunt's cheeks. She caught sight of Mrs. Henderson giving her a standing ovation, and Ethan grinning like he was about to burst with pride. When the ceremony concluded, and Grace had officially graduated, she was surrounded by classmates and family members, offering congratulations. But the moment that would stay with her forever came when she was walking toward Patricia's car, diploma in hand. Grace. She turned to see Michael standing about 20 feet away, careful not to violate the restraining order, but clearly desperate to speak with her. He looked older than she remembered, his face drawn with something that might have been regret. "I heard your speech," he said, his voice carrying across the distance between them. Grace waited, but no apology came. No acknowledgement of his failures or recognition of her worth. Just the same Michael who had always expected her to manage his emotions and make his choices easier. "I hope you find what you're looking for," he said finally. Grace studied her father's face, this man who had once been her whole world, and had gradually taught her that she was unworthy of love. For a moment she felt an echo of her old instinct to comfort him, to minimize her own needs, to make his guilt more manageable. Instead, she squared her shoulders and spoke her truth one more time. "I already have," she said quietly. "I found people who see my worth without me having to prove it every day. I found family that doesn't require me to shrink myself to fit their comfort zone. I found exactly what I was looking for. I just had to leave your house to find it." Michael's face crumpled slightly, but Grace felt no satisfaction in his pain. She'd moved beyond needing his acknowledgement or his approval. She'd built a life that reflected her actual worth, surrounded herself with people who celebrated rather than tolerated her existence. As she walked toward Patricia's car, where her chosen family waited to celebrate her achievement, Grace felt the final pieces of her old life falling away. The girl who had accepted scraps and called them love was truly gone. In her place was a young woman who knew exactly what she deserved, and more importantly, had the courage to demand it. The feast she'd built for herself was just beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.